Are there good medical and spiritual reasons to drink alcohol? When you open up the Bible, what you find is specific and clear teaching about the harms that are associated with excess alcohol consumption. Think about Proverbs chapter 23 and verses 29 through 32. Notice the text. It says, "Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who tarry long over wine, those who go to try mixed wine. Do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder." When we think about what the Bible teaches about excess alcohol consumption, drunkenness is condemned at several places in the Bible. In the New Testament, that occurs in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 7, and in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 8. But what about the ethics of moderate drinking? Say, one glass of wine with dinner. What does the Bible teach about moderate drinking? I want to address that question today and look at some of the medical aspects and some of the spiritual aspects and the biblical aspects as we analyze the morality of even moderate drinking. Here's my plan for the session today. First, let's look at the landscape of alcohol in medicine. Maybe you've heard someone say, "Well, don't you know that red wine is beneficial to your health?" Is that true? What does some of the current data reveal? Number two, what about moderate drinking? Is that okay? Would people in medicine recommend individuals to drink moderately from time to time? And third, how does the Bible address alcohol consumption from a moral and spiritual perspective? So first of all, let's look at the landscape of alcohol in modern medicine and some statistics. When we talk about alcohol, chemically, we're talking about a substance known as ethanol or ethyl alcohol. It's flammable, which means it ignites, and it's volatile, which means it evaporates easily. As a medicine, ethanol would be classified as a sedative hypnotic. It's a psychoactive drug, and it is the most accessible drug in the world. So much discussion in medicine focuses on the excesses of drinking and the harms from addiction and abuse of alcohol, but we also want to spend some time at looking at what medicine says about moderate drinking. When we think about alcohol, not everyone metabolizes alcohol the same way. People's livers are different. And with that, there are different ways. There are two pathways, actually, that the liver will break down alcohol, will metabolize alcohol. And not everyone metabolizes it the same way. There are certain factors that play a factor in how people break down alcohol. Not every body type is exactly the same. The way an 85-pound lady metabolizes alcohol will be different than a 330-pound male, especially given their history of alcohol use and things that play into that. Multiple factors can play a role. For example, a person's genetics can play a role in how they break down alcohol. There's an enzyme in the body known as alcohol dehydrogenase, and different people can have variants of that gene in their body, and that can impact the way in which they break down alcohol. It can cause sometimes an intolerance to the way in which people break down alcohol. Number two, sometimes consumption rates will differ between people. 5 beers over 5 hours or 5 beers over 30 minutes. The consumption rate will play a role in how a person is impacted. Body weight plays a role. And then there are certain diseases that can play a role in how a person breaks down alcohol. If a person has delayed gastric emptying, a condition known as gastroparesis, then that can play a role in how a person might break down alcohol. And then tolerance. A person's exposure to alcohol over a period of time can play a role in how they break down alcohol. When we think about alcohol and the harms, it is a factor in injuries and even in fatalities. And what are some of the numbers? Here's some numbers from the National Institute of Health about alcohol. Alcohol is involved in 30% of suicides. Alcohol is involved in about 40% of fatal burn injuries. Alcohol is involved in about 50% of fatal drownings and of homicides. Alcohol is involved in about 65% of fatal falls. When you think about it, 1/3 of injuries in trauma centers involve alcohol. Interestingly, the World Health Organization in 2018 recognizes that alcohol contributes to 200 diseases and different injury-related conditions. What are some of those? Well, some of the harms that they talk about are liver disease. We know that alcohol can cause something called fatty liver disease and even cirrhosis. Alcohol can play a role in cardiovascular disease and sleep disorders and pneumonia and different types of cancers. Alcohol can play a role in depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. Alcohol can play a role in babies. Maybe you've heard of fetal alcohol syndrome. Alcohol can play a role in infections, and alcohol can play a role in something called alcohol-related blackout, and certainly we know that alcohol can play a role in addiction. Alcohol results in 3 million deaths every year, 5.3% of all deaths, actually. And when you think about the prevalence, in the past year, more than 174 million people have used alcohol in the United States. That's 62.3% of the population. There are millions of emergency department visits. There are more than 10% of the population that is wrestling with alcohol use disorder. When you start looking at the number of deaths from alcohol, the number comes up to 140,557 deaths in 1 year. Among working age adults, 1 in 10 deaths are from excessive drinking. And when you start thinking about the economic cost in the United States, we're looking at something to the tune of $249 billion in loss. And you could break that down into healthcare components and workplace productivity and collisions and criminal justice, $249 billion of loss if you were to take those and add them together. When you think about the use of alcohol, 28% of adults in the United States have unhealthy alcohol use. 25% of those 12 and older report binge drinking in the past month. And that would be defined as 5 or more drinks for men or 4 or more drinks for women. So when we think about alcohol, we realize that there are some significant harms that certainly come with alcohol. But what about the medical benefits of alcohol? Are there indeed some good things that alcohol can be used for? Well, when we look in our Bibles in Luke chapter 10 and verse 34, we read the account of the Good Samaritan. And in the account of the Good Samaritan, we see that wine had an antiseptic use. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 34, he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Well, the oil would soften a wound, and the wine would serve as an antiseptic. He helped this individual because he had fallen on hard times. And we see that alcohol can have an antiseptic property, and that's in the Scriptures. In Proverbs chapter 31, verse 6 and 7, it says, "Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more." And we see in Proverbs 31 here that there's a time at the end of life where alcohol as a medicine would certainly be appropriate if a person is in distress and they're to the point of dying, that alcohol as a medicine would prove beneficial then. And then we turn over into 1 Timothy chapter 5. And Paul says this to Timothy: "No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments." So here we can see that there was some necessity in Timothy's life for the consumption of wine. Today, when we think about it, alcohol still has antiseptic properties that enables it to kill pathogens. It appears in hand sanitizers. It's used topically, rubbing alcohol you're likely familiar with. Medically speaking, alcohol may be given in instances of toxicity. For example, if a person were to consume windshield wiper fluid. Some windshield wiper fluid contains a substance known as methanol. Or if a person were to consume antifreeze, sometimes alcohol is given. It may not be a first-line agent, but it could be used medically in instances of certain types of toxicity. Also, when we think about alcohol, it's important that we pause for a moment and think not only about its harms and its benefits at times, but we want to narrow our focus here. And let's think about moderate drinking for just a moment. What's the difference in excessive drinking and moderate drinking in the medical context? Medically, what exactly is binge drinking, for instance? Moderate drinking is defined as 2 drinks or less a day for men, or 1 drink for women. The National Institute of Health says this: "Drinking less is better for health than drinking more." A drink is defined as a single 12-ounce beer that contains about 5% alcohol, a 5-ounce glass of wine, which contains about 12% alcohol, or a 1.5 ounce portion of distilled spirits. And this would have as much as 40% alcohol. That's what's defined as a single drink. When it comes to binge drinking, that can occur and individuals can have high blood alcohol levels where it can reach illegal levels. If a person were to drive, 0.08% would be an illegal level in states when it comes to driving. When it comes to binge drinking for men, again, this is 5 or more drinks in a 2-hour period. For women, it's 4 or more drinks in 2 hours. So we're seeing the difference between what health individuals would define as moderate use and binge use. When we think about the medical benefits of alcohol, maybe you've seen in the headlines, red wine is beneficial to your heart health. Again, we're not talking about the excesses here, but we're talking about the moderate use. We know that the excesses can cause certain problems in a person's body. But I want you to reflect on a study that's more than 30 years old, actually. It was a study that was put out in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1988. Pretty old study. When you think about what was in this study, it was a prospective study of moderate alcohol consumption in middle-aged female patients. It was a prospective study of moderate alcohol consumption and the risk of coronary disease and stroke in women. Well, this study is quoted from time to time in different literature. It goes all the way back to 1988. What exactly happened in this study? Well, the researchers here went back to 1980 and they surveyed 87,526 female nurses who were between the ages of 34 and 59 years of age. And they assessed their consumption of beer, wine, and liquor. What did they find exactly? They counted 200 incidents of severe coronary heart disease. And that was 164 non-fatal heart attacks and 36 deaths. They also counted 66 ischemic strokes and 28 subarachnoid hemorrhages. What did they conclude? They concluded, based on prospective data, that moderate alcohol consumption decreased risk of coronary heart disease and ischemic stroke, but could increase subarachnoid hemorrhage. So compared to non-drinkers, there were some cardiovascular benefits based on these surveys. And you might think, well, that ends the debate. There it is. There's some data from this research study that clearly says that moderate drinking is beneficial to heart health in some instances. Maybe not all of them, maybe not subarachnoid hemorrhage. You may think the debate ends there, but in medicine it doesn't. And I want to be crystal clear with you about this study and what it demonstrated and what it did not demonstrate. Again, it was not touting the benefits of excess drinking. It wasn't talking about the hazards of drunkenness or things like that, medically speaking, but it was a prospective study. And based on these findings, it's important that we understand, well, what exactly is a prospective study? A prospective study is different than a randomized control trial. And what this prospective study in 1988 established was it established an association. And that association is reported in something known in medicine and in research as a relative risk. In statistics, we know that sometimes relative risks can overstate the magnitude of certain findings. What does that mean exactly? What it means is this, that people can overestimate the findings and have more confidence in an association more than they should. Finding an association does not establish a definitive cause and effect relationship. And that's a really important point in science. One prevailing proverb in science, and maybe you've heard this if you've taken science classes, is this, that correlation does not equal causality. That means that merely because an association is demonstrated or discovered does not mean that you have cause and effect. If you were to take another piece of research in 2015 in the Journal of Internal Medicine, it pointed to lower disease and death, morbidity and mortality, among light to moderate drinkers, reducing risk of coronary artery disease with contributions from ischemic stroke and heart failure. However, moderate drinking could lead to increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke. So here we move up in time from 1988 all the way to 2015, and we see another study that seems to be indicating some beneficial effects of moderate drinking as well. And you might think, well, the debate ends there. There we see the heart benefits of drinking just maybe one or two drinks on occasion. However, in 2023, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, there came out an article that looked at all-cause mortality, essentially dying from alcohol use. And this was published in this prestigious journal known as JAMA. And what that study found is that low-volume alcohol drinking was not associated with protection against death from all causes. And here's a quote: "Observational studies tend to show that people classified as moderate drinkers have longer life expectancy and are less likely to die from heart disease than those classified as abstainers. Systematic reviews and meta-analysis of this literature confirmed J-shaped risk curves, protective associations at low dose with increasing risk at higher doses. However, mounting evidence suggests these associations might be due to systematic biases that affect many studies." What's this JAMA study showing? Well, it's saying that, hey, we need to question those former findings and that there may be systematic biases that are occurring in those studies. One of the concerns of the study is how former drinkers are put in the same group as lifetime abstainers. So you could imagine if an individual who drank for 20 years, that there could be lasting and prolonged health impacts that would be different than a person who had abstained from alcohol all their lives. Listen to Catherine Lesko. She's from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Listen to what she said. "There's this question about whether low-level drinking is beneficial. And I think I'd take this to mean that it's really not particularly beneficial." She went on to say, "A lot of the results are reinforcing the harmful effects of even moderate to high-level drinking." When you think about it, when you think about the health impact, and when we're thinking about medicine and alcohol and health recommendations and this notion that floats around, and you'll hear people say, well, the heart benefits of one glass of wine with dinner. I want you to see that there's some information that would go against that. Take the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They published these dietary guidelines for Americans from 2020 to 2025. And here's what is stated in those dietary guidelines by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They say, the dietary guidelines does not recommend that individuals who do not drink alcohol start drinking for any reason. The National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism states that certain groups should avoid alcohol completely. Who are they? It says that if you're driving or operating a machine, you need to avoid alcohol completely. If you're on over-the-counter or prescription medicines, or if you have certain health conditions, if you're recovering from an alcohol use disorder or unable to control your drinking, if you're under the age of 21, if you're pregnant or may become pregnant, they say that you have no business drinking at all. Legally, when we start thinking about it, there are certain states in the U.S. that have what are known as zero-tolerance laws. This means for those under 21 years of age that a single drink could land a youth with a DUI charge. But then what about the American Heart Association? What do they say? They say if you don't drink already, do not start. Further, they address, isn't red wine supposed to be healthy? If you were to look on the internet, you could find a Q&A sort of section. They say there's more to the story. They say no research has proved a cause and effect link between drinking alcohol and better health. This is the American Heart Association. No cause and effect link. They say components in red wine, such as flavonoids and other antioxidants, can potentially reduce heart disease risk, but they can also be found in other foods like grapes or red grape juice or blueberries. They continue. It's unclear whether red wine is directly associated with the health benefits seen in some studies, or whether other factors are at play. It might be that moderate wine drinkers are more likely to have a healthier diet and lifestyle, including physical activity and lots of fruits and vegetables. The American Heart Association does not recommend drinking wine or any form of alcohol to gain potential health benefits. Let me say that again. The American Heart Association does not recommend drinking wine or any other form of alcohol to gain potential health benefits. Instead, they say, take steps to lower cholesterol, control high blood pressure, manage weight, get enough physical activity, stay away from tobacco, and follow a healthy diet. But people have questions about other aspects of alcohol, particularly red wine. What about this substance known as polyphenols? Polyphenols are substances that occur naturally in red wine. They also occur in dark chocolate and tea and in berries, and they're touted for their health benefits. If you go back to 2012, there was a study in the American Journal of Hypertension that demonstrated that red wine polyphenols did not decrease blood pressure in subjects with high normal or grade 1 high blood pressure. So we see that some of these benefits that are touted, that this information is challenged. Think about what the Mayo Clinic says about moderate drinking. They say this: while some health benefits may be possible, eating a healthy diet and being physically active have much greater health benefits and have been more extensively studied. They continue, keep in mind that even moderate alcohol use isn't risk-free. For example, even light drinkers, those who have no more than 1 drink a day, have a tiny but real increased risk of some cancers, such as esophageal cancer. And drinking and driving is never a good idea. So the notion that there is this blanket, everyone should be drinking 1 glass of red wine with dinner because of the health benefits, that's simply not supported when we start looking at different areas in medicine. And that brings me to my third point. How does the Bible address alcohol consumption from a moral and spiritual perspective? In certain instances, alcohol could be used as a medicine and used and blessed by God. We pointed out some portions in Scripture where that was the case. Morally, it was justified for an individual who was using it for an antiseptic. We see it as being used as a medicine there. It's sometimes given to individuals who are dying or near the point of death. It's sometimes given to individuals like Timothy who have frequent ailments. We're seeing that alcohol is there being used for medicine. But then we think, well, what about the social consumption of alcohol? Well, we've mentioned that drunkenness is certainly condemned. We could look at multiple passages like Galatians chapter 5 and verse 11, where drunkenness is described as a work of the flesh. We could look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, and we could see that drunkards will not inherit the kingdom of God. And we could look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 2 through 5, and we could see that drunkenness will come under God's judgment. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 11, Paul says not to associate or even eat with the person who is a drunkard. We clearly see that drunkenness is condemned by God through the Bible. But what about the moderate use? Even moderate uses of alcohol should be avoided. Why? Well, in small doses, alcohol is still a toxin. And it's a poison of the mind. Unquestionably, alcohol is a psychoactive substance. Its harms are apparent. Its harms are abundant. And the use of alcohol socially is full of potential harm. It could lead to addiction. It could lead to abuse, and that starts with just 1 drink. And we go back to Catherine Lesko, who was commenting on that 2023 JAMA study, who was at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She said this again, and I repeat, there's this question about whether low-level drinking is beneficial, and I think I take this to mean that it's really not particularly beneficial. Those were her words. Even small amounts of alcohol can impact sobriety and self-control. Multiple passages point to that. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Alcohol can impact the sobriety of the mind. And look at 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. It says, the end of all things is at hand. Therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 25. It says this, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. One of the fruit of the Spirit is described as self-control. Galatians chapter 5 verse 23. Self-control is a Christian virtue. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6. 2 Timothy 1 verse 7. For God gave us His Spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. So it's imperative when we think about self-control to let God, through the Bible, guide us in what exactly it means to be self-controlled. Alcohol, when we think about it, It's a passion of the flesh. And we're commanded to abstain from passions of the flesh that war against the soul. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11 says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." In summary, the notion that moderate drinking is beneficial for health reasons, it's scientifically and medically challenged, given some recent data. Alcohol will destroy your spirit. It will negatively impact your influence for the cause of righteousness. So when you think about alcohol, the most important thing to do when you think about alcohol and its use is understand, okay, it does have some medical uses. But socially, recreationally, we need to be people that glorify God in our body. And we can do that by abstaining from the social use of alcohol. Let's take every thought captive to obey Christ. Let's let God empower our lives by being individuals that are sober in the day and sober in the night when we're awake. Let's take every thought captive to obey Christ. Let's be sober and let's give no opportunity to the flesh. Yes, excessive drinking is wrong, but there's no good reason for moderate drinking either. Let's abstain so that God may bless our lives and so that we may be the light in the world to all those who are around us.